This isn't just a story about the Wild West. It's about a secret so massive it could crush a woman, a ranch, and a man built like a mountain. You won't believe the truth that unfolded the night Grace Abbott whispered those terrifying words. "You're too big. It won't fit." Her first night, the tiny, Boston-bred mail-order bride, Grace, was alone in a rough cabin with Ezekiel Kane, the giant of the Montana plains. He was 42 years old, silent and terrifyingly immense. His shoulders were the width of a barn door. His hands were thick as oak. He was a force of nature in human form. Grace, all 24 years of her, was a delicate blossom of fear and desperation, fleeing poverty. She'd traveled thousands of miles, guided only by a grainy photograph and a terrifying hope. She saw him, and she knew she'd made a catastrophic mistake. He didn't greet her with a smile, just a slow, measured stride that ate up the dusty ground. When he steadied her descending from the stagecoach, his grip encompassed her whole forearm. She felt impossibly small. The journey to his ranch was a blur of endless, mocking prairie. The house felt isolated, a candle flame against infinite dark. Dinner was silent. Every beat of her heart was a frantic drum against the weighty reality of their impossible union. Then came the bedroom. Small, confining. Ezekiel, towering over her, began to unbutton his worn shirt. Grace watched his massive chest, his flexing muscles, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of him. He moved closer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beat of her own pulse. The raw, untamed power radiating from him solidified into an overwhelming physical terror. She realized the disparity was not just in size, but in worlds. She choked out the words, her voice a fragile thread. "You're too big. It won't fit." It wasn't just about the act. It was a confession of her fear of the colossal, unyielding life that now lay before her, a life as immense and daunting as the man himself. Ezekiel froze. His huge hands, halfway to unlacing his shirt, stopped dead. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, seemed to crack, betraying a flicker of a deep, ancient pain. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just turned, walked to the far corner, and slept on a cot he'd obviously kept hidden under a bearskin rug. Twist one. The giant rancher who bought a bride for survival was a gentleman. But why was he so alone, so reserved? The next morning was quiet, but Grace's intelligence, honed on the cutthroat streets of Boston, started working. She noticed the utter lack of personal effects. No pictures, no knickknacks, just tools and supplies. Everything was utilitarian, almost like he was waiting to leave. The answer, or the next layer of the mystery, arrived that afternoon. Two weathered riders, Miller and his volatile partner, rode up in a cloud of dust. They weren't neighbors. They were vultures. "Heard you've been letting your cattle roam a mite too far north," Miller rasped, his eyes cold. "Drinking from our creek." Ezekiel walked toward them, his frame suddenly rigid. The land, the water. It was a life-or-death battle here. "My land stretches to the North Fork. Always has," Ezekiel rumbled, his voice low, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable, quiet authority. The younger man spat. "That creek's on our side. You're stealing our water with that new well you dug." Grace realized this wasn't just a squabble. The new well was a source of envy and resentment. Miller's final words hung in the air like a noose. "The West ain't big enough for lone wolves who hog all the resources." The ranch wasn't a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege. Twist two. The terrifying man she feared was now the only thing standing between her and a far greater danger, a conspiracy of greedy neighbors ready to claim his empire by force. That night, the conspiracy struck. A sharp, splintering crack tore through the darkness, followed by the terrifying tinkle of glass. Grace jolted awake. A A window shattered, sending the cabin into chaos. They were under attack. Ezekiel was already moving. He was a force of nature, rising from his cot with a speed that belied his massive frame, snatching his Winchester rifle from the hearth. "Grace, stay low. Get behind the stove." His voice was a low, terrifying growl of command. Gunshots erupted outside, furious volleys that peppered the wooden walls. Grace scrambled, watching Ezekiel become a fortress of flesh and steel. He moved with a terrifying, focused intensity, his movements speaking of years of honed survival. The front door groaned under a massive assault. "Open up, Cain. We know you're in there," Ezekiel answered with a single devastating shot. A yelp of pain confirmed his aim. But as the siege escalated, Grace had a moment of startling clarity. He was one man against too many. He needed help. She lunged for the oil lamp, her small hands surprisingly steady as she turned up the flame, casting a wider, flickering circle of light. "Ezekiel," she called out, her voice trembling but firm. "I can hold the light." He gave a brief, grim nod of approval. She moved cautiously, feeding cartridges into the rifle, staying low, her gaze fixed on his broad, protective back. Then a hulking shadow burst through the kitchen window. Ezekiel spun, firing. But in that split second, a second, faster figure darted from the side, grabbing Grace. "Got the girl, let's go," the man snarled, dragging her towards the splintered front door. A roar erupted from Ezekiel Cain. It wasn't a human sound. It was the guttural bellow of a wounded beast, a primal surge of fury that shook the very foundations of the house. He launched himself across the room in a colossal leap, hitting the man with the full, unbridled force of his massive body. The man was pinned against the wall with a sickening crunch. Ezekiel's immense hands found the attacker's throat. The remaining raiders, hearing the horrific sound and Ezekiel's animalistic roar, hesitated. Then they fled. The first rays of dawn illuminated a scene of quiet devastation, splintered wood, bullet holes, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Grace, huddled in a blanket, watched Ezekiel scrub his hands in a basin. She was no longer afraid of his size. She was in awe of it. The magnitude of him, once a source of unease, had been the unyielding shield that saved her life. He had fought for her with a relentless, selfless ferocity. He was not merely a giant rancher. He was a protector, a bulwark against the savagery of the world. She walked toward him. He slowly turned, and in his eyes she saw not the stoicism of a solitary man, but a flicker of concern and quiet tenderness. "You're too big," Grace began, her gaze sweeping over his powerful form, now seeing it not as an obstacle, but as an anchor. A genuine smile touched her lips. "But maybe that's exactly what I need." They had survived the night, forging a profound connection in the crucible of terror. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The attacker Ezekiel had pinned was gone, taken by his fleeing comrades. But he'd left behind a crucial detail, a small leather pouch that had fallen from his coat during the struggle. Ezekiel picked it up. It was heavy. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were not tools, but 3 gold coins and a perfectly rendered, hand-drawn map. Twist 3. The attack wasn't about cattle or a creek. It was about something hidden on the ranch. The map was crudely drawn, but marked a specific point, the location of Ezekiel's new well. Beside it, however, was a faint, nearly erased symbol that looked like a skull and crossbones. Grace recognized the faint drawing instantly. In Boston, she'd spent years reading anything she could get her hands on, including penny dreadfuls and local histories. That symbol wasn't from a local gang. It was the mark of a legendary, long-dead bandit known as Black Jack's crew. "Black Jack," she whispered, "the one who supposedly buried a payroll of $50,000 in gold during the war." Ezekiel's eyes widened, a look of pure shock crossing his massive face for the first time. He'd lived on this land for decades, hearing the tales, but dismissed them as folklore. The map didn't mark the well. It marked where the well had been dug. Ezekiel had accidentally dug his well straight into an old, forgotten landmark, a marker pointing to the real treasure. The 3 gold coins in the pouch weren't just payment, they were the bounty, a sliver of the actual treasure the attackers had been promised by whoever was orchestrating this. Twist 4. Ezekiel's new well wasn't the cause of the conflict. It was the unwitting uncoverer of a massive, long-lost gold hoard. The land dispute was just a cover story. Ezekiel and Grace spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of whispers and digging, their new bond cementing with every shovelful of earth. The spot marked on the map was just 3 feet from the well's stone rim. They found it, a heavy iron-bound chest, rusted shut, buried in a deep pocket of clay. The weight of it was tremendous. Inside, the gold shimmered, untouched by the century of earth. Thousands of coins, payroll, bars, far more than $50,000. It was a king's ransom. But as the sun dipped, they heard a sound, the distinct, measured clip-clop of a single horse approaching. Too slow for a bandit, too deliberate for a friend. It was Miller. He stood on the porch, a chilling smile on his scraggly face, his hands empty. "Found your map, Kane?" "Good," Miller said. "Saves me the trouble of digging up half your ranch." Grace felt her heart sink. Miller wasn't just a disgruntled neighbor. He was the mastermind. He knew the legend, found the bandits' old map, and had used the water rights as a perfect local cover for the digging. Twist 5. The angry neighbor who led the attack wasn't the real villain. He was the scout for a far more powerful, unseen force. Miller let out a slow, unnerving laugh. "You think I'd risk my neck for a few stray cattle, Kane?" "No. I was hired. Hired by the man who owns the original claim deed to this whole damn territory." "The deed is filed in town," Ezekiel rumbled, stepping in front of Grace. "Oh, it is," Miller said, his smile widening into a terrifying sneer. "And you, Kane, are a squatter. You've worked this land for 42 years, but you never officially bought it. You just claimed it. The man who bought the paper, who financed my search, is riding into town tomorrow." Miller paused, taking a breath, savoring the moment. "He's bringing the U.S. Marshal with him, and the man who financed him. That's not the biggest surprise." Miller gestured with the tip of his hat. "The man who owns this land, the man who wants the gold, and hired me to get you off the claim. It's your brother." Ezekiel, the giant of the plains, staggered as if he'd been shot. Grace watched his massive body tremble. The pain in his eyes was not fear, but a betrayal so deep it threatened to shatter him. Twist 6. The reason Ezekiel lived alone, the source of the deep, ancient pain in his eyes, was a family betrayal. His own brother, who thought him dead, had been watching, waiting, and plotting to steal his life's work and his inheritance. Ezekiel's brother, a slick East Coast politician, had bought the deed years ago, thinking Ezekiel died out west as a young man. The brother had only recently discovered Ezekiel was alive when a letter arrived from the town clerk about the new well. The brother had financed Miller to get the gold, then planned to arrive the next day with a legal claim, and the marshal casting Ezekiel out as a simple squatter. Ezekiel's terror was not for the gold, but for the loss of his home. And now the shock was too much. "He's riding in tomorrow," Miller repeated, his voice cruel. "You're too big, Kane. Too big to fight the law and a deed that's signed, sealed, and delivered. The gold's ours. The ranch is ours." Miller turned to walk away. "I suggest you take your little Boston bride and ride out before the marshal sees you. You'll be locked up for resisting a legal claim." The situation seemed hopeless. Legal documents, the U.S. Marshal, and a lifetime of betrayal were all stacked against the silent giant. But Grace, the small woman who had fled the lawless streets of Boston, suddenly found her voice. "You're wrong, Miller," she said, stepping out from behind Ezekiel. "The law is not on your side." She pulled out the small leather pouch. Miller laughed, thinking she was trying to ransom herself with the 3 gold coins. "The map didn't just mark the well," Grace explained, her voice steady and clear. "It marked Blackjack's final resting place." She unfurled the map again, pointing to the faint symbol near the well. "That symbol is not a gang mark. It's an old cemetery plot marker. Blackjack's crew was known for a distinct, secretive burial rite. The gold was the man's coffin." "What are you talking about?" Miller sneered, confused. Grace continued, her eyes locked on his. "The man you hired to attack this ranch, the man who dropped this pouch, is a grave robber. The gold is his loot. He hired you not for a simple dispute, but to obstruct justice and steal a corpse's property." She then pulled out one of the 3 gold coins. "These aren't bounty. They're stolen evidence. The marshal will arrest you for conspiracy to commit grand larceny and violating a federal gravesite long before he looks at any deed." Twist 7. Grace, the bride, wasn't just a witness or a protected object. She was the legal key, a witness to a crime that superseded any land deed in federal law. The fight was no longer about property, but about a far greater historical crime. Miller's face went white. He wasn't afraid of a rancher. He was terrified of the federal government and the specter of grave robbery. Grace hadn't just saved Ezekiel's life. She had saved his future. Ezekiel, finally finding his voice, a low rumble of absolute authority, spoke directly to Miller. "I know my brother. He wants this life. He wants this land. Tell him to ride in tomorrow. Tell him the marshal will be welcome, but tell him I have the evidence. Tell him his name will be on the front page of every paper as the man who financed a grave robbery on his own brother's land." Miller, defeated, simply mounted his horse and rode away in the deepening twilight. The next day, Ezekiel's brother, the politician, arrived with a bewildered marshal. Grace, calm and articulate, laid out the evidence: the map, the stolen gold coins, the testimony of the attack, and the undeniable presence of the iron-bound coffin of gold. Faced with a federal investigation, the brother made a choice. He admitted the deed was his, but claimed he was only trying to retrieve family property, and promised to sign the ranch over to Ezekiel immediately if the marshal quietly dropped the grave robbing charge. The marshal, eager to avoid a sensational, complicated, and legally murky Gold Rush-era case, agreed. The satisfying resolution: Ezekiel kept his home. Grace became the legal owner of half the ranch as his wife, a shrewd move she suggested before the marshal arrived, and the gold, the real treasure, was quietly invested in the ranch's future, paying off any old debts and solidifying their empire. Ezekiel, the giant who feared his own size, found peace with a small woman whose heart was bigger than the whole Montana Territory. He never called her small again. She never again said, "You're too big." Instead, years later, watching the sunset over their thriving empire, she rested her head against his colossal chest and whispered, "You're just right." If this relentless story of betrayal, gold, and a giant finding his match against all odds gave you chills, don't let the secret end here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next tale of history's wildest, most unbelievable twists.